Store. My name is James Fallows. I'm a writer for The Atlantic, a veteran of the Ideas Festival, and delighted to be your host for this afternoon. One of the ongoing themes of these Ideas Festivals since their beginning, 15 years ago, has been how to understand China, how to make sense of its internal developments, its external relationships, its economic miracle, its social non-miracles, all the other things that are happening in China. And we have an excellent panel here to talk about a particular aspect of making sense of China. And before I introduce our three wonderful panelists, I'm going to say a little bit about what our ambition is for this time that we all have together in the next while. I think all of us who have dealt with China over the years know that among the things that make it the subject compelling, apart from just the profound importance of the topic, are its complexity, its contradictions, and its ceaseless change. The complexity means, of course, that any of us can talk about only particular parts of it at any given time and a little tiny part of the whole. The contradiction means that anything we can possibly say about China is true somewhere, and its opposite is true somewhere else. And so the task is making sense of the proportions between them. And the ceaseless change, of course, means that the riskiest thing to do about China at all is ever to predict anything, because it's just a matter of making sense of where the trends seem to be tending, having benchmarks for assessing things in the future, and other skills, cognitive skills of that sort. So that is at least my hope for the next 50 minutes we have here until we adjourn at 4, that by the time you leave today, you'll have a even richer sense of mental tools, not for what's going to happen next week or next month in China, but how to make sense of what you hear happening next week and next month and next year, and how to judge the ever-changing flux of what's going on. To guide us through this mental and geospatial and military-focused and strategic-focused exercise in thinking about China itself and the relationship with the outside world, especially during this era of making China great again under Xi Jinping, we have three excellent panelists. I'm going to say just a word about each of them. You'll see more of their backgrounds in your folders. Immediately to my left here is Amira Rapp-Hooper, who among her many accomplishments is now a senior fellow at the China Center of Yale Law School. She's been involved in U.S. policy towards China, U.S. strategy towards China, so she is here. Next to her is Jorge Guajardo, who among his many accomplishments, he was for 6 years the Mexican ambassador to China. These coincided with the years when I was living in Beijing, my wife Deb and I, and we became very good friends with Jorge and his wife Paula and their family have remained friends. He has been at the intersection of China itself, its relationships with North America, with South America, with the world, and so he is ideally equipped to speak on those topics. And at the far end of the panel is Elsa Kenya, who is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security, and she's been studying very hard on Chinese military innovation, and that part of the hard power aspect of China's relationship with its neighbors and with the United States. The plan for the time ahead is we're going to, near the end of our discussion, we'll turn it over to you all for questions. Before that, I'm going to try to lead our panelists through an exercise, again, of giving us ways to think about military developments, civilian developments, political developments, and all the rest. I'm going to do it by first asking each of our panelists to do something impossible, and yet they are up to it. I say that knowing their work, knowing Jorge personally for a long time. And Jorge, since you're the one former ambassador on the stage, we're going to start with you. If you were doing if this group here were the U.S. National Security Council, or if it were the Mexican National Security Council, or some people in Singapore or Korea or whatever, and you were trying to say, here is the 2-minute way to understand where China is right now in this arc under Xi Jinping. Are things more authoritarian and getting worse? Are they expansive and getting worse? What's your initial framing for us?
So I would start by saying that yes, things are more authoritarian and getting worse, but how should we look at China? And a lot has been written about China becoming more assertive under Xi Jinping, which can be debated. Some people say that assertiveness came back from the Hu Jintao years, that there is nothing new to that assertiveness. What I would say is that what what has changed is China has become arrogant. And I would start by saying the way I look at China is as an arrogant power. And I'll give you a quick example. I arrived in China as Mexico's ambassador in 2007. And I remember there were a lot of interviews that the media, and it's all state media in China, they would all ask you, for your perspective on China, Mexico, whatever it was. And they would always end with the same question, which was, what can China learn from Mexico? Which I, of course, with humility, I would say, well, no, we're not here to teach anything. We would be, I try to play, the role of somebody who comes to bearing lessons for another country. And fast forward to 2008, the financial crisis, and then in 2009, I kept giving those same interviews, and at the end of the interviews, that last question changed to what can Mexico learn from China? And that, for me, was very indicative of how China just changed in the way in which they assumed they had nothing to learn from the world, and they were ready to start imparting wisdom on the world. So that's how I would describe the way China is now.
That is very interesting. And as you and I have often discussed, we look back on those as the golden age of Hu Jintao, when you were first there as ambassador. So Mira, let me turn now to you. So Jorge has said there's been this marked tone in China's sense of its place in the world, its relationship with Mexico and the United States. What would be your initial framing of how we should think of China at this moment?
Well, the frame I'd love to offer is actually how we should think about the way the United States is debating China right now and what is going on with China. And that is as follows. And if you attended the Great Power Rivalry panel this morning, you'll forgive me 30 seconds of repetition, but I hope it'll be worth your while. There is a very strong sense in the US foreign policy community that views of China have markedly changed and have crystallized towards a new consensus in just the last 2 years. And that is a consensus that the United States and China are locked in a great power competition and are going to be for the foreseeable future. According to this narrative, China, as it has risen, has essentially dashed some of the deepest held hopes of American policymakers about what China would look like as it rose. There was the hope that as China grew stronger economically, it would democratize. And there was also the hope that as China joined the so-called international order, the web of norms, institutions, rules, and regimes, that it would become more like that order rather than changing that order. And according to many policymakers and thinkers in Washington right now, both of those sets of assumptions or hopes have proven false. And the United States now finds itself faced with a near-peer rival in China, who is likely to be a major power competitor for the coming decades and is likely to be an authoritarian major power competitor. So you see that sort of crystallizing narrative animating so much of the debate going on in Washington right now about what the United States should do with respect to China. However, I would note that while this consensus seems to have crystallized incredibly rapidly, many of the most important implications, many of the questions that really underlie it haven't even been asked, never mind answered. Those questions include, what should be the United States' objectives vis-a-vis China as it continues to rise? What does the United States seek to protect in Asia and with respect to its own global leadership? And these are some of the questions that we are only just starting to grapple with, despite the fact that this consensus appears to have shifted so quickly. So while things are tough right now, and I do expect they will remain competitive, I actually also think there is a lot of open space and unanswered questions that we have to grapple with before we really know the future of US-China relations.
So thank you. And one specific follow-up before I turn to Elsa. You said that part of the U.S. assumption had been that China would democratize as it got richer. Did many people actually think it would democratize as opposed to liberalize?
So liberalize is the better word, to be sure. Democratize was sort of the highest hope, but liberalize is more accurate. And even in that sense, I think these hopes were no more than heuristics. There was not a deeply held sense amongst the American diplomatic community that China was going to become a Jeffersonian democracy anytime soon.
Great, thank you. So Elsa, your opening framing of where China stands, so Jorge is talking about the change in China, Mira is talking about the change in the United States. How would you give this opening frame?
So I actually just arrived in Aspen from Beijing yesterday evening, so please forgive me if I'm rather jet-lagged, and after having just spent a week in Beijing, I think I'm actually more confused, perhaps, not less about the future of US-China relations and also trying to catch up on all of the news I missed when my VPNs weren't working over the course of my time there and I could not access more independent sourcing on media and recent events. But I think I'll look at US-China relations in general from the perspective of technological competition, which I think clearly has become quite a prominent element of this rivalry. And here, too, there is a certain tension or contradiction. On one hand, you have the loftiness of China's technological aspirations and ambitions to lead the world in AI and to emerge at the forefront of what is seen as a new industrial revolution. But on the other hand, you have, beyond that hype and beyond that arrogance, you have the continued weaknesses in key and core technologies that have been rather prominently exposed in the past couple of weeks with, for instance, the pressure that Huawei is under as a result of the entity listing, which has denied them access to US technologies. And there's an interesting discrepancy between, again, the long-term aspirations for China to be a superpower in science and technology, but the very difficult and pragmatic challenges in the near term, particularly when it comes to complex technologies like semiconductors. And at the same time, on the question of has China at all liberalized, I think there's also an interesting tension between, on one hand, quite disturbing applications of some of these technologies in surveillance in Xinjiang, where there's appalling repression happening, but at the same time, quite active debates over the past couple of weeks in Beijing on the ethics of AI by academics and researchers who are quite sincere in their conviction that AI can be used for good, and Chinese policymakers who hope to leverage AI in a rather utilitarian framing to improve society, to stimulate the Chinese economy at a time when it's slowing, and seemingly not always a recognition of how, at least from an American perspective, the use of these technologies for repression and their more positive application for development can seem to be at odds in some respects. So it definitely was an illuminating week in many respects, but also did highlight some of these core tensions that are persisting and I think will continue for quite some time to come.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to you again, Jorge, with an implication of what Mira was talking about. She was saying there's a sense within the US government that something should be done. You've been sort of ahead of the pack in arguing for several years in your writing that something should be done. There should be a change in the Western world's policy towards China. Is the something that's being done now by the current US government something that's effective and sensible, or is it just something?
That's a great question, one that I always have a hard time answering for this simple reason. In comes President Trump, and he starts addressing China, and I'm conflicted because I'm Mexican. And I don't need to explain how I feel about President Trump. I'm Mexican. But on the other hand, I'm seeing what he's doing with China, and I'm kind of like, oh, I kind of like it. You know, I kind of like what he's doing. And so how do you go about saying, I support anything he's doing? So I kind of not, but I think what he's doing with China started in the right direction, which was pushback. There's something that I particularly liked about the way he started addressing China, which was with no China hands in the room. And I think China games that very well. China has its China hands in the United States government community that they use, and they're the ones that have to go back to their leaders in the US and say, well, we can't do this for the sake of the relationship and so forth. And what I sort of liked about President Trump is that he just took out those China hands and said, either you give us what we want or it's not going to work, and China needed to be addressed in that way. Having said that, that was when he started. Fast forward to now I'm really concerned because what began as pushback in the commercial trade sector, which was very much warranted, has turned into sort of targeting China as a whole. So now you have President Trump saying every Chinese student in the United States is a spy. You have FBI Director Wray saying China is just a whole of government approach to stealing secrets from the United States. And now you start seeing how they're going, not after China as a trade competitor or market potential, but just as a threat in general. And I think that is very worrisome. MIT President Rafael Reif just yesterday, I believe, issued a letter warning about this targeting of the Chinese community. And that's something that happens very quickly and very easily in this administration. Jim, you've seen how we started with every Muslim is a potential terrorist, and we went from there to every Hispanic is a potential MS-13 member, and now it's every Chinese is a potential spy, and that worries me.
So Mira, let me ask you about that too. Jorge confessed his conflict of interest as a former Mexican ambassador. You have a perhaps more profound one as the Asian policy director for the losing presidential campaign last year. So from that perspective, for the popular vote winning, electoral vote losing 2 years ago presidential campaign, how do you weigh the fact, do you agree or not with Jorge's assessment that overall the Trump emphasis has been a correct one with China?
I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than distilling Trump as sort of the apotheosis, excuse me, of pushback against China. I can say that I think any president, and certainly the other choice for president, would have taken a much firmer line on China starting in 2017, even if that person was not Donald Trump. There was a strong sense in, again, the American foreign policy community before Trump came into office that things had fundamentally changed, that in retrospect, the pivot point had probably been 2008 after the financial crisis, when China began to become much more assertive, much more arrogant on the global stage, thinking that the United States was stumbling, and that, of course, that had only continued and intensified after Xi Jinping took power. So there was a very strong sense amongst Democrats, too, that different policy options were needed towards China, and a much more holistic approach was required. I think Jorge is right that there are some useful things about sort of focusing Chinese attention on the U.S. willingness to push back on issues like trade. But frankly, my overall problem with the way that things have proceeded during this administration is that nearly everything that has been done unilaterally. And where it has been done unilaterally, it's often been done at the expense of alienating friends and allies. So whereas it is strictly true that it was time for the United States and China to have a trade reckoning, it is not necessarily true that the United States needed to level tariffs against our allies at the same time that it pursued that course of action. While it is strictly true that Chinese technology and Huawei are deeply worrisome and vexing problems for us to think about in the next several years, U.S. friends and allies are also worried about the spread of Chinese technology, are worried about intellectual property theft, and should be on board with U.S. thinking about future China strategy in those areas as well. So from my perspective, we have seen a very narrowly focused and unilateral American strategy towards China at the time when we really should be looking for a multilateral strategy that is holistic in its approach and intends to deal with China over the long haul, not just in an immediate and combative manner.
So before asking you, Elsa, about some of these security implications of the current policy, I'm going to give one other Atlantic Magazine-centric indication of this shift in U.S. policy. For the Atlantic Magazine, the December issue every 4 years is a real problem for us because it goes to press before the presidential election, and it comes out just after the presidential election. So we have to write things not knowing who's going to win. So for the cover story for the December 2016 issue, I actually wrote something about, and I think the headline was something like, what if China is going bad? And the idea that whoever was going to be president, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or whoever else, this was going to be their challenge of finding some way to deal with this shift in the center of gravity about China. So Elsa, as you, from your perspective and thinking a lot about military technology and security issues, is there how would you say this last 2 years of sort of a different China policy from Donald Trump, what security ramifications has that had that we should know about?
So I guess I'd say to start, I think we've seen an increasing convergence of economic and national security considerations under this administration, which perhaps ironically is not too dissimilar from the way that China's leadership thinks about state or national security as including economic elements of concern. And I think increasingly there has been a similarly sharp course correction in assessments of China's capabilities and innovation, as well as starting to see the Chinese People's Liberation Army as a near peer or even peer competitor. And I think similarly to the sort of rapidly shifting and crystallizing consensus on policy, there's been a course correction perhaps from one extreme to another in a sense, or sort of from a sense that skepticism over whether China can innovate to concern that China is beating us in the race for everything. And I think that certainly we should not dismiss China's rapid advances in technologies like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and of course, fifth-generation telecommunications, 5G, which has been something of a buzzword and flashpoint lately, but at the same time, I think often this administration's policy responses have been fairly reactive and reactionary rather than thinking much more proactively about what we need to do ourselves at home. And I think across the board, whether we're talking about military modernization or technology, some of the best policy responses to the challenge that China presents, I think, do start in the United States and policies we need to be pursuing ourselves for any number of reasons, but that do become more urgent when we see the competitive challenge that China presents. So for instance, rather than being concerned that we are in an AI arms race, again, as a side note, AI is not a weapon. It's a general purpose technology that has many applications, including in military affairs, but more importantly, could transform our economies and our societies in ways that have long-term ramifications for competitiveness. But rather than sort of reacting against that, I think we have seen some positive responses in terms of increased investments in AI and a move towards an AI strategy, including from the Department of Defense. But I think there's much more that needs to be done, including in terms of significantly increasing resourcing for research and development in a number of realms of science and technology that are critical to our future, and also thinking about our own education, our own institutions, infrastructure, and of course, with regard to the US military in particular, recognizing the need to rethink some of our assumptions as the Chinese military aspires to emerge as a world-class force, and the US can't take for granted some of the advantages we've had in the past. But again, I think a lot of the policy responses do need to not simply be reacting against what China's doing, but thinking very critically about what we need to be doing ourselves.
Here is a surprise element for this stage of the discussion. Usually what you would expect is more of what I've just been doing here of asking big policy questions, and we hear from each three of our panelists. I have a whole list of specific questions. I'm going to ask one per person, and so this will be sort of the spot quiz part of the session. If anybody else wants to volunteer and come back to the answer. So Mira, I'm going to start with you. Last night at the debate, the first Democratic debate, at the end, the final question is, what is the greatest threat to the United States? And one answer was climate. One answer was Donald Trump. Several people answered Russia. A number of people answered China. Were the people who answered China, was that a sane answer or not?
I think it is an absolutely sane answer, although I would certainly pair climate change along with China. However, I would prefer to frame it as challenge or perhaps profound challenge as opposed to threat. I think when we reduce to the word threat, we are inviting in the sense of the United States being in a new Cold War with China. And while it is possible that we could get there, it is also possible to have great power competition, sporting relations, without feeling like the country is under profound threat from another superpower.
And a follow-up for that, given your former campaign role, what's the short version of a speech? Let's say Hillary Clinton were on that stage again last night, to say China is a profound challenge but not an enemy. How do you make that point?
I would make the point actually picking up on something that Elsa just said, which is that when it comes to competition with China, this is really ours to win. Unlike in the Cold War, when Americans feared that they were going to wake up one day to find out that the Soviet Union had invaded Germany or that nuclear weapons were flying towards the US homeland. That is not the threat environment we live in. We live in a threat environment where there is going to be tension over economics, over technology, over rules of the game inside institutions. But the thing we need to do to prevail in that competition is to reinvest in ourselves at home. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in science and technology and our innovative capacity. And by doing all the things we should do to keep ourselves a strong 21st century power, we're perfectly prepared for competition with China.
Thank you. So Jorge, here is your spot question. Over the last year, and especially the last month, there have been two profoundly important developments in special regions of China. Of course, in Xinjiang, the imprisonment, the concentration camps of Uyghurs. In the past month, the startling demonstration by Hong Kong people. How should external powers encourage the best outcome, either for the Uyghurs or for the people of Hong Kong, without encouraging backlash and worsening responses from mainland China?
Let me start with Hong Kong, because I think Hong Kong is very indicative. So as I'm sure all of you have followed, there have been massive protests in Hong Kong against an extradition law that they wanted to passed into law that would allow China to pretty much extradite anyone even transiting by Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong people that supposedly were promised all these great things about being part of China have come to, in the following 22 years since the handover, come to realize that it's not as promising as they had first assumed. So they went in massive numbers out on the street, 30% of the population. So percentage-wise, I think it's the biggest protest seen anywhere. And I think that is very indicative as we think of China in other regions of the world. Part of the Washington narrative, as you know, Jim, is that China is taking over the world. China is in Latin America, China is in Africa, China, beware China, because China is really making moves. And I always say the same thing. Listen, there's nothing the US has to do. The Chinese will go and do it for themselves. All you have to do is let them go in, and they will be the ones to scare the people away from them. And Hong Kong is a great proof of that. And I can give you many other cases. I always say siding or partnering with China is like going to bed with an elephant. You're going to get crushed. You're going to get crushed. So that's what I got out of the Hong Kong protests. I'm not sure I have a good answer for the Xinjiang situation, which is just a tragic situation in which they're imprisoning up to 1 million Uyghurs for social control. The only thing I will tell you that as a Mexican watching this, I can tell you the United States has lost its moral authority to address this issue.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So Elsa, now a spot question for you. You're just back from Beijing. There has been brewing for quite a while an apparent tension or contradiction within China's Xi Jinping era strategy, which is it's doing everything it can to modernize the economy, make it more technologically advanced, have a modern population, even while tightening down in every way possible politically. This would seem to be an impossible act to carry out indefinitely. What is your latest on-scene report of whether this is a manageable contradiction for the Chinese government in the long run, or if something will give, what will give?
I think Xi Jinping certainly hopes it will be manageable to both sustain and increase party control, but also to harness the dynamism of technology companies that are increasingly quite powerful in their own right. But I think there are elements of this paradigm that can start to backfire. So for instance, China's launch of a national plan or program in AI in 2017 attempted to combine a state-driven approach to accelerating AI development with the market dynamism that was already well underway. And you've seen both these top-down efforts as well as bottom-up efforts by local governments throughout China to launch their own AI initiatives. And in some cases, this drive for AI may go a little bit too far, and you may see certain inefficiencies that come into play there, with, again, everyone marching along with Xi Jinping's ambition to lead in AI and huge inflows of billions, if not tens of billions, through some of these investments in ways that can often result in poor investment decisions or something of a bubble in AI in China, in ways that can undermine the healthiness of the overall ecosystem. So I think the sort of state-driven approach can be problematic there as well. And I think that core tension between seeking to promote innovation, but also requiring that some of these self-same technology companies have party secretaries and party committees, and cracking down on activism at some of the leading universities in China on their campuses. And I think the ways in which there's a potential chilling as some of the technologies involved in repression are under more pressure in the US with regard to potential entity listing and around the world. So I think there are certain inefficiencies in this model. I think the drive for control may sometimes overwhelm the ambition for enthusiasm, but I think it does come down to a synergy insofar as the CCP's legitimacy is based on performance, and the hope, I think, is that AI can deliver economic growth and societal improvements at a time when there are very difficult policy challenges that are otherwise quite resistant to solutions.
So we have one more round of spot quiz question, but you are empowered in this time if you want to answer somebody else's previous spot quiz question, you can. So Mira, this question is about a Russia versus China comparison and contrast. The news for several years now has highlighted efforts, technologically and otherwise, for Russia to interfere in the mechanics of American elections, of American information culture, et cetera. Number one, why are we not hearing the similar reports about China? Why would China not want to do that if Russia is doing it? How should we think about the Russia versus China technological and election interference comparison?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my general read, and I would certainly be curious for Elsa's views as well, is that China and Russia are picking tools that are appropriate to their power position in international politics. So as much as we talk about the United States being in great power rivalries with both Russia and China these days, Russia is actually a power that is fundamentally in decline. Whether you are looking at its economic numbers or its demographic numbers, Putin is running Russia like there will be no Russia after Putin. And he might be right about that, at least in its current form. This is a country that is going to find it harder and harder to make ends meet over the course of the coming years. And tools like cyber intrusions, like disinformation, like election interference, are a great way for Russia to pursue its goals of pushing back against European integration, disintegrating NATO, and disrupting the leadership of the United States at relatively low cost to Moscow, and that's all it can afford. China, by contrast, is a power on the ascent that has long-term goals in the next decade of becoming the major power, if not just a major power in Asia, which I dare say it's largely already accomplished, and by being a superpower on the global stage by mid-century. And that requires China to continue rising. That is to say, Xi Jinping not to do anything that would result in global pushback so significant that it would thwart China's rise. China hopes to continue this ascent. As a result, you see a rich and powerful nation that continues to grow richer, investing in its military for the long term, certainly investing in cyber capabilities and technology that will be the sort of technology of the future, but not necessarily seeking immediate short-term disruption, because what China is after is really a much longer-term set of goals.
And I agree with Mira on those fronts, and I would just add, I think we're also seeing an interesting learning on the part of Chinese leaders from some of Russia's tactics. So very distinct objectives, but also perhaps some trends to watch going forward. So for instance, there have been allegations that Beijing interfered in Taiwan's elections last fall. There was an incident recently that appeared to involve boosting of a pro-Beijing candidate based on a somewhat sophisticated social media campaign, and often Beijing's propaganda has been very clumsy and ineffective. But at the same time, there are some indications of increasing sophistication and trying to appeal to audiences beyond China. And it's worth noting that most major American newspapers do carry inserts of China daily, which does reflect something of an asymmetry that for all retired Chinese diplomats may complain that China's voice is not heard enough in DC. There is certainly differences in terms of access to information and the ability to really transmit certain messages to tailored audiences. And I think going forward, we could see not only the history of United Front work of sort of more traditional attempts to influence public opinion and decision-making in democracies, which has been controversial in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States sometimes, with attempts to cultivate certain stakeholders or promote certain viewpoints, often through tactics that are covert, corrupt, and coercive, sometimes involving financial incentives. So that has been ongoing and is continuing, but there's also some early indications of at least experimentation with techniques to promote manipulation through social media and otherwise. So that is, I think, just getting started, but will be worth watching going forward.
I would add to that, my point of view is that they don't do it because they're incompetent and they don't know how to do it. They would very much would want to do it, but they end up, as you say, putting a China Daily insert in the Iowa and the Des Moines start trying to influence. I mean, that's their way of looking at it. So it's not that they don't want to, it's that they don't know how to. And you mentioned the case of Australia, New Zealand, and that's what we should be looking at. The way they're going, trying to influence. I always say that Australia is to Chinese foreign influence what Estonia is to Russian cyber attacks. That's where they are trying out other techniques, and they're doing it in Australia, and they have done it successfully so far. So that's where I would be looking for the way they act.
So, Jorge, because we're long-term friends, you have your choice. Would you like a supply chain question or a military question?
Supply chain.
Okay, supply chain.
I'll take supply chain for 100.
Okay. It's the daily double. So we've spent a lot of time together in Shenzhen and other places where the supply chain has taken form over the past 2 decades. An explicit goal of the Trump policy is to relocate that supply chain, to move it to Vietnam, to move it wherever else. Can that work?
Yes, it can. I don't see the wisdom behind it. So yes, China has built long supply chains that mostly favor U.S. consumers and U.S. companies benefiting from those supply chains. I don't see the wisdom behind saying, let's not do it in China, let's do it in Vietnam, let's do it in Malaysia, hopefully in Mexico, and hey, I'm all for that. I just don't see the wisdom behind that. If it's for security reasons, I will also question that, but I'll grant you the security question because that's a whole different ballgame. If it's just supply chain, just for the reason because we don't want China to be in our supply chain, it doesn't make sense. What does make sense is to make sure that China plays by the international trading rules. And that's why I started by saying I like the way the Trump administration started pushing back on that front when it was just about trade. I did not think that focusing on the deficit was smart. Nevertheless, that was a distraction. What was smart is to say you are gaming the system, you are not giving equal access to US companies in China, you are still subsidizing Chinese companies that compete in unfair conditions with American companies. So there were many things that you had to push back, but to attack the supply chain, I don't see the wisdom behind that.
Yeah. So Elsa, a question for you. What's the short way of how we should think about Huawei? What's the right policy to apply to Huawei?
I'll try to give a short answer. It's a complicated controversy these days. I guess I would say to start, for all the talk of 5G as a race, I don't see 5G as a race, and I don't think Huawei is winning. And I think we need to think much more systematically about what our interests and our long-term objectives are in 5G, not only in terms of security. I think there has been some politicization of the question of Huawei, but I think without running through the totality of their history and the multiple incidents that give reason for concern, I think it is clear that Huawei is a company that is operating within a system where there is a real possibility it could be compelled to cooperate with the Chinese government in intelligence work. That is a matter of Chinese law, as that is quite explicitly articulated. There's also the fact that Huawei not only has a history with the PLA, but has actively worked with the PLA and continued to do so. So I think there are reasons from a security perspective to not want Huawei to be in our critical infrastructure, because 5G is not simply faster 4G. It could really transform connectivity, whether from future smart cities or applications like self-driving cars or in healthcare. So I think there are reasons to make sure that the vendors in our future 5G ecosystem are unlikely to be subject to undue pressure from a foreign government that could result in compromises of our cybersecurity going forward. But I think, at the same time, I think we need to move the conversation beyond Huawei and think about how do we ensure that the US is well positioned to reap the benefits of 5G and recognize that it's not just a race. We're getting there first matters. We have to make sure 5G will be secure by design. We need to work towards a more healthy ecosystem where, for all of the Huawei's claims that they are the undisputed leader in 5G, and Ren Zhengfei's claim that Huawei's ambition and ideal is to stand on top of the world, the way that they've gotten there is not necessarily through having superior technologies, but through undercutting and underbidding their competitors in ways that have really undermined the whole industry. And having a Huawei monopoly on the world stage is not good for 5G anywhere. So I think beyond the security concerns, we also need to think about the future of 5G and how to make sure that's a secure future and one where the US is well positioned through our own investments and our own infrastructure to take advantage of that.
Thank you. So I'm going to have one last quick question for Mira. This is the military question that Jorge didn't get to answer, and I'll set it up.
Double.
Batting cleanup.
Yes, you're batting cleanup. So I had the chance a number of years ago to see a meeting between the then chairman of the PLA, the then commanding general, and the then U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And a message that the U.S. was then Admiral Mullen. A message he got across to his Chinese counterpart was that the Chinese military at that point contained no combat veterans, because China has not been at war, and the U.S. is always at war, which has its obvious downsides, but it means there's a lot of combat veterans, a lot of, a test of doctrine. You could read that as the Chinese military being properly cautious about what it doesn't know, or the Chinese military being reckless because it doesn't know what it doesn't know. how should we think about the possibility of reckless military confrontation between the U.S. and China?
So it's a great question. The lack of combat history for the PLA, the last time the PLA was at war was in 1979 with Vietnam. There is no one currently serving the PLA who has fought before. This is just one of several areas we could point to in China's military that remain strict liabilities, despite the fact that the PLA is modernizing at an incredibly rapid clip. Others include its likely inability to conduct long-term overseas operations, problems with strategic lift and logistics, simply not having practiced the type of operations that the United States has. That said, when we talk about the idea of risk in the military with China, we're sort of talking about the idea that there could be some kind of skirmish, let's say in the South China Sea, that would escalate into and just absolutely epic conflagration. And while that is strictly true, there could be an unintended encounter between vessels. There could be some form of escalation that comes from China's militarized South China Sea islands. My worry is actually much more about intentional than unintentional conflict. It's my view that both the United States and China actually seek to avoid war with one another. There are lots of reasons for this, but the main one is the one I have already mentioned, which is the fact that China intends to continue to rise. So I think that the government in Beijing, the CCP, has a lot of reason to tamp down escalation if it were to start at a low level. That makes me more concerned about intentional conflicts, such as potentially over Taiwan.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions. If a microphone runner will go, I can't see you all, so microphone runner, please go to somebody, and then I can't see, so please just choose somebody with a question. Yes.
Years ago, the Russians took over a large piece of China to complete their Trans-Siberian Railroad, including Vladivostok. In today's world, Russia's taken over Crimea. Might China say, well, Russia, you took over Crimea because it used to be yours. We're going to take over Vladivostok because it used to be ours.
Who would like to answer that? I'll give that to one.
I don't see it happening, to be honest. I mean, there is a natural animosity between Russia and China. No matter how much they pretend to be friends and great allies right now, there is natural animosity. I don't see them acting on those territorial moves the way you see.
And Mira, yeah.
I would concur entirely. I see no sign of Chinese territorial irredentism. However, I do think that there are ways China is already seeking to spread its influence that could aggravate the Russians. I'm thinking there of the Belt and Road Initiative and the fact that Chinese influence is spreading into Central Asia, which is a perceived Russian sphere of influence. So I think it is entirely possible that through more subtle, non-conflict-based means, you could see aggravated tensions between the Sino-Russian, axis, such as there is one.
Thanks. I think we have somebody over here. Yes.
Sure. A quick question for all three. Given Chinese society is thousands of years old, face matters. The way we talk to the Chinese matter. Given all of these issues that you all raised are really important in the U.S.-China relationship, China's relationship with the West, security and everything else. 10 years from now, will the way this administration's tone, tenor, style have been with China, will they be a competitor or will they be an enemy?
So, Elsa, you may lead off. Here.
I'll just say I don't believe that any relationship is inherently adversarial, and personally I do think that seeing China as a rival or competitor, it can be healthy if we don't look at competition as zero-sum. Personally, I don't think we should see China or call China an adversary outright, because I think if you look at the scope and sweep of the history of US-China relations, which is quite a lengthy and complex history already, I think it has changed and evolved over time and will continue to do so. And I think I do think that trying to maintain an pragmatic engagement on issues of mutual interest, that becomes more important, not less, when competition is intensifying on other fronts, including militarily.
So lightning round from the two of you.
I would say that face matters, but I think you will see more damage done with Mexico, with Europe, with Japan, and with all the other countries that have been insulted just the same than with China.
Yeah.
Because if nothing else, China was supposedly an adversary, the other ones were allies. So that's where you will see probably more lasting damage.
I'll just add that it is my understanding that if Donald Trump does turn out to be a one-term president, his counterparts in Beijing are likely to miss him. There are, some degree to which this has been tough. The trade war has been tough for China, but some degree to which they find him eminently understandable. His transactional style of diplomacy, his sort of personalist willingness to engage with autocrats is not something they're likely to see again in his alternative.
That's true.
Somebody on this side of the room, yes, whoever has the microphone, yes.
Hi there. Do you see there's anything that we can do in the West to combat the one belt, one road debt trap diplomacy that China's kind of doing all around the world? We see it in Djibouti, we see it in Sri Lanka. Is there anything we can do in the West to combat that?
Again, my message is don't worry about that. China will take care of itself. I mean, you have then Secretary Tillerson and now Secretary Pompeo traveling around the world saying, beware the Chinese, beware their investments, they're corrupt and they're trying to entrap you. And you see every country in which they have gone in, be it Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, regretting having received them. So don't worry about having to convince these countries. China will do it for you.
And I'd also say, instead of focusing on trying to counter one belt, one road, I think the U.S. should concentrate on providing positive alternatives. There are elements of this initiative that are genuinely appealing to countries that don't have other options for investment. And there are huge shortfalls in infrastructure throughout Asia. So I think that there's a lot the U.S. could do to have much more of a positive agenda, not saying beware the Chinese, but rather saying this is an American alternative that will be better managed, not corrupt, and provide better outcomes all around.
I will also just tack on that this is a space where the United States should be learning from its allies who have really been first movers in this area. Japanese investments in Southeast Asia far exceed China's dollar injections into the same area. Abe has kept a very low profile in his asymmetric strategy to think about Belt and Road, but simply by providing higher standards alternatives, American allies are already helping to lay bare the fundamental liabilities of the Chinese model, just as Jorge indicated.
On this side, whoever has the microphone.
Hi. Earlier this year, Xi Jinping actually issued a directive on unification of Taiwan. I would like to know what your thoughts are, and also in terms of election coming out in Taiwan. If the current president gets re-elected, do you think that Xi Jinping would speed up the reunification process, and what would the impact be for the United States?
So who would like to kick this off?
Mira, of course.
No,
Okay, so that's the $64,000 question that happens every Taiwanese election, every Chinese new president, and every time there's a conflict. Will that be the spark that starts the war or the Chinese invasion of Taiwan? I have nothing concise to refer. My gut feeling is it will not happen. It is not in the interest of the Chinese right now to have war as a distraction, whether it be in Taiwan or anywhere else in the world. But again, it's a very complicated question, and there are many ways to dismiss what I just said in a smart way. So.
I guess I would just add, I think what we will see is attempted election interference in Taiwan become much more active and aggressive going forward, as well as economic coercion. And while I think that the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan remains slight, including because the PLA has certain core limitations in its capabilities, and an amphibious invasion is not a simple undertaking, I do think that when Xi Jinping calls upon the PLA to be ready to fight and win wars, and if you look at the recent trajectory of Chinese military reforms, which have been quite historic, sweeping, and far-reaching, and are still very much in process, but I think if we start to look out to 2030 and beyond, the PLA could have the capability to do so, and that it certainly would increase the potential for much more active coercion, deterrence, or, again, worst case, least likely scenarios, I think shouldn't be ruled out, and I think all we can do is continue to invest in Taiwan's defense to make that a harder job for the PLA.
So, Mary, you've been spared by the clock. So the point of any discussion about China is to begin a conversation and assessment that it will go on for all the rest of our lives. So please join me in thanking our panelists for the way they've helped us.
Thank you, Jim.